of artificial intelligence, Turing was keenly involved in the development of the first self-modifying stored program computer. He also proposed a method for determining machine intelligence. The now famous Turing test. Turing contributed pioneering work in biology in the area of nonlinear dynamics. During World War II, he was principally responsible for cracking the German Enigma cipher, a development that may have turned the tide of the war in favor of the Allies. His best-known published work include On Computable Numbers in 1936 and Computing Machinery and Intelligence in 1950. His work in the field of probability studies, especially his paper on the Gaussian error function, eventually netted him both a Smith's Prize and a fellowship at Cambridge. In his highly influential paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, which debuted in a philosophical journal, Mind, in 1950, he proposed that if a questionnaire communicating with a trio of subjects, two of them being human and one computer, via typed responses, could not distinguish which one of them was a computer, then the computer would be called intelligent. This Turing test, as it is known, and Turing's optimism for the future of artificial intelligence has remained a source of inspiration to various enthusiasts and researchers. Besides being a great scientist, Turing was a gifted athlete, nearly qualifying for the 1948 British Olympic track and field team. Welcome, friends. I would like to invite Professor Bala, the chairman of ACM Delhi NCR chapter, to introduce the workshop to you.
Dear students, my faculty colleagues from various institutions, research fellows from various institutions. Today, it has been a sort of a wonderful experience to come over here. I was just talking to my colleagues and saying that getting 15 students out of their beds at 8:30 on a Saturday to come for a Turing Centenary celebration right across the city, I think, speaks a lot for Turing, the speakers that were going to speak, and to Nilima for her enthusiasm in arranging this event. All of this must have contributed to this, I would say, close to a miracle. Whether it is more than Turing's contribution or not, I don't know, but definitely it's as difficult in today's circumstances. Just to introduce you to the Delhi chapter, so the Delhi chapter now has started around a year and a half back. Mukesh has been driving it with a lot of energy, and some of us have been trying to contribute it in small way. But the important thing is that we are at a very exciting time of computer science in this country in general and Delhi in particular. Many new institutions are coming. Old institutions are getting revived in terms of professionalism, interest, and research interests. Organizations, many organizations, research organizations have come to the NCR region in the recent past. It's important that we create forums which are cross-institutional forums, which gives people an opportunity to interact, an opportunity to make this society much more professionally attractive. All of us should realize that any particular region attracts more professionals when the professionals who are present there are active professionally. In the software context, Bangalore is a living example of it. The presence of a large number of software organizations in Bangalore has been a magnet to attract more organizations because manpower is a key. Unfortunately, this country has not seen this type of growth of professional interaction bodies for, I would say, we have never seen this happen. And this is to some extent has been a tragedy because institutions have been isolated. We are all living in our own world. We only interact with our own faculty, colleagues, and students. We don't really interact across with professionals either from industry or from other academic institutions. I strongly feel that now we have crossed the threshold with a number of institutions getting both. So I strongly feel we have crossed that threshold where I think these activities can take off in a much larger fashion, create forums which will actually provide opportunities for people across these institutions to interact. This, in my opinion, will be one single strongest growth factor of both research as well as development in this particular region, in this area. This has been our main objective behind starting the ACM Delhi chapter as part of the ACM India. And we hope that in our own small way, we can contribute to NCR being established as a happening place in computer science and allied fields. Thank you. With that.
I would like to invite Professor Maheshwari for his talk on understanding Alan Turing and his scientific legacy. Professor Maheshwari has been involved in teaching and research in computer science for more than 35 years and is currently a very senior faculty, a professor of computer science and engineering at IIT Delhi. He has been the head of the department as well as Dean of Undergraduate Studies at IIT Delhi. He is widely regarded as one of the most senior computer science faculty in the country, and he has played a very significant role in the development of computer science education and research in the country. In his long scientific career, he has made significant contribution to theoretical computer science and algorithms research. He has innumerable number of publications in high-indexed, high-impact factor conferences and journals. More recently, he has been working on problems related to bioinformatics and systems biology. I invite Professor Maheshwari to give his talk.
Okay, yeah, good enough. कैसे जाएगा भाई? I can't access इसको जरा आप
This will be the E-drive.
This must be it.
This Turing top.
Right. Okay, good. Now let's go into the.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, good. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Nilima, for asking me to come and give this talk. For me, Turing has a very personal meaning. And let me give you what impact it had on me when I was a young man of 22. I had finished my BTech at IIT Delhi, at IIT in '69, electrical engineering. And the area that I had specialized, or I thought I specialized, was control systems. And IIT faculty had done a good job in giving me opportunities of studying basics as well as reasonably advanced topics there. And I thought that I wanted to, when I go out, I would work in the area of control theory. So I landed up at the desk of my advisor, who was presumably going to be my advisor at Northwestern, Professor Van Ness. And he then sat with me to decide what should I be doing in that first quarter. So he showed me the syllabus, and there were these control theory courses, and I said, I've done it. And he showed me another one. I have done that too. And then he smiled, and he then suggested that I take a course in automata theory, which in my what I would call arrogance of being an IT student, I must have done that too. See, he smiled and said, no, I don't think you have done that. So I signed up for the course, and I never took a control theory course ever again in my life. The experience was a transformational one for me. Automata theory was Turing machines and related topics, but they fascinated me to the extent that the worldview, perspectives, what one wanted to do in life totally changed. And I'm tremendously grateful to the man. When I look back and see the way I've spent my life since then, I have a sense of happiness that I've been thinking, doing what I'm doing, meeting people that I'm meeting, okay, being a part of a process which has been advancing at a very revolutionary rate, and all because of the person whose centenary we are here to celebrate. So one of the things when I started thinking about this process, which happened to me when I came back to IIT Delhi to teach, was to make sure that the students learned what I was teaching so well that when they went out, they don't have to do that again. There's something new that they will do. Study something else, explore something else. Okay, what one teaches is essentially past, at least at the undergraduate level. Okay, future is something else. Sometimes they don't even know what it is. But if they are at a good place, opportunity comes, anything can happen. Okay, so I will take you through my understanding of Alan Turing's intellectual journey. What led him to what he was doing? What did he do? And what impact that has had on our own worldviews, what we do, how we live, and conduct ourselves. Okay, so for me, this whole thing began in some serious way in the year 1900. There was an international collection of mathematicians which took place in Paris, okay, where Hilbert gave a talk, okay, and Hilbert defined an agenda, okay. So the mathematical agenda set by Hilbert then was that the foundations of mathematics have got to be strengthened. Okay, the proofs have got to become rigorous. We need to understand what we are doing. Okay, because at that time, there was a sense that great mathematics and a great mathematician was one who could explain the latest to the guy on the street, okay, in a few words. I mean, that type of brilliance is good, but it has got to be, at least Turing felt, it has got to be built on very formal and firm foundations. So he essentially said the following. This particular quote that I have given here is actually from the transcript of his talk. The talk was in German, perhaps, but the English translation has been published. It was published in the year 1900 itself. It's available, and I have basically taken it from there. The requirement for the solution of a mathematical problem is, it shall be possible to establish the correctness of the solution by means of a finite number of steps based upon a finite number of hypotheses which are implied in the statement of the problem and which must be exactly formulated. The axiomatic system, the requirement of axiomatic system is very firmly laid down here. And if you now read this, notions that computer scientists actually work with and take as given are already all there. The notion of an algorithm is there, okay? And of course, what was being talked about was the axiomatics of mathematics. So when one reads about the environment that took place at that place, there was the great mathematicians who were all there were amused at the idea that theorems of mathematics could be churned out like sausages, because that's implied here. You know, the axiomatics should be such that you should be in a position to prove theorems. Okay, so they thought that this mechanization, this process, which computers didn't exist, but there was still a formal process which was being talked about. Mechanize the process, okay, understand it, and prove theorems. So that's the agenda that Hilbert set. And of course, in that talk is the place where he actually listed out the 23 problems of mathematics that need to be solved. Okay, Hilbert's 10th problem is one of them, okay, and many others. Some have been, most have been solved, some are still there. So that's, but our point of view, our interest is only from the point of view of how does it impact what computer science has become. So this agenda was in some sense worked at by Whitehead and Russell, okay, who wrote a book called Principia Mathematica in 2008, okay, which essentially did three things: formalized mathematical knowledge, mathematical logic, developed higher order logic, and which also laid down the foundation of type theory. You know, the Russell's paradox is actually solved by the notion of types, and types are very important to computer science. We take them as absolutely the most logical things to happen, but they were done for the first time. See, the intellectual climate at that time was such that this particular book, coming out of this book, was considered as one of the great events of intellectual endeavor at that time. Okay, Russell became a superstar. Okay, something at the same level of, and if you read the comments on his book, reviews and all, they would say that yes, indeed. Saurav, is there anything? Sorry, yeah. Subtract 100. Okay, it is 1908. Yes, indeed. Okay. So there might be many more such mistakes. In fact, that reminds me of something, you know, preparing for this talk, I was reading about Hilbert. I have his biography written by Constance Reed, and something very amusing happened. Hilbert's writings always had mistakes. Okay, so when they started in the 30s, thought that they would bring out a volume of his work, one of the things that they had to really work at was to correct all the mistakes. So they got one person to actually go through everything, correct everything. Okay, and then create the volume. They gave it to Hilbert. He looked at it, and he did not even notice the things had been corrected. Okay, so so this was actually turned out to be a major high point in the intellectual achievements of that time, because it was thought that yes, indeed, it's being shown yes, mathematics can actually be axiomatized. Okay, and so what we will basically now do is to just go through for a few minutes of exactly what this axiomatization meant. Okay, so propositional logic was known at that time. Boolean, Peano's axioms, and everyone else knew that, and we know that that's the basis of designing of circuits which actually do the computing that we know of. But let's see, what does it really mean? It is a theory of declarative sentences that combine Boolean variables using Boolean connectives. Okay, so here's a sentence: if monsoon fails, then there will be drought. Okay, so we can break it up into P, stands for monsoon fails. This could actually be true and false. Monsoon fails, it doesn't fail. Q, there will be drought. True, false. So the thing is, these sentences on Boolean variables took only two values, true, false. Okay, and of course, this particular statement we could actually write as P implies Q. Okay, there's a formalism within which you could establish whether this particular statement is satisfied. Okay, right? So, but this was known. Propositional logic had actually been known, and for Russell, first order logic that we will now talk about, okay, was also being talked about. Okay, so when we talk of propositional logic, all of us understand what we're talking about. There are certain axioms of the system, right, using which we establish the correctness of statements. There are theorems. Things can be, a propositional statement can actually be satisfied, it may be unsatisfiable, right? All those issues we understand, so we'll not worry about them at the moment, but just move on to say what exactly is first order logic. So the first order logic is sentences in FOL contain predicates, functions and relations, quantifiers in addition to symbols permitted in propositional logic. Okay, so let's just take an example of what it could be. Here's a sentence: you can fool some of the people all of the time. It's a part of a thing that, but you ultimately can't fool all the people all the time, right? So we've taken it from there, and how is this can be converted into a sentence in first order logic? So okay, so there's a predicate can fool PT. You can fool person P at time t. Okay, and using this we can write there exists P for all t can fool PT. Okay, right. This is a sentence in first order logic. Right? Okay. Now, what is it that we can actually get out of first order logic? What is it, in which way is first order logic different from propositional logic? Apart from the fact that there are functions and relations which are added to it, there are quantifiers. But the most important thing is that the domain of values which are used are now totally different. Okay, they're not true, false anymore. Okay, so there's a notion of what exactly can it be satisfied by. So it's the universe here consists of things which we call people, things that we call time, isn't it? And so there is this notion of a model, right? Which is essentially the type of values which can actually be used for working out what is whether the sentence is satisfied, valid, and so forth. And there can be, the interesting thing is, there's no unique model. There can be a number of models for the same thing. There's a model of natural numbers, model of graphs, there are other things, and there are many results which actually were worked out. And let me just point out a few of them because they have an implication on what we are going to talk about. With the notion of here, in propositional logic, there was only two notions, satisfiability and a statement being a theorem, a tautology, right? Here there are additional notions. Okay, there's a notion of satisfiability in any case. Satisfiability is that there is a model using values of which the sentence is satisfied. Okay, it's true in that model. Okay. Validity is when the sentence is true under all models. Okay. So that's the validity. And of course, tautology, theorem is still there as it is. So there's an additional notion, two notions of satisfiability and validity. Validity is when it is over all models. Okay. Sentences which can actually be worked at are the ones where all variables are bound. That's when they are sentences, otherwise they are basically functions. Okay. So here is one type of a model that we are talking about. Let me give you another model that exists up here. Okay, here the relation G is over X and Y, and the sentence is for all X, for all Y, Gx, Y implies Gyx. Okay, and this sort of a sentence is also the model which works for this is also symmetric graphs actually, and a symmetric graph actually satisfies it. Okay, so the models can be varieties of things. Okay, right? And the interesting thing is that if you really look upon this first order logic with graph models, then one realizes that there is very little that one can actually say about these. You cannot even capture the notion of in a graph whether between two nodes there exists a path, reachability. You can actually capture there is an edge. You can say this transitive, right? But the transitive closure, that there is a path, cannot be captured. It's very, in some sense, very restrictive. Okay, so working within the graph models, very restrictive, but you add to it the axioms of arithmetic, you get the full power of arithmetic. Okay, so it's a very strange animal, very powerful in some situations, not too powerful in the others. Okay, so, well, how do you, if you can't capture everything, then there must be something else that you can do. That's the second order and higher order logic. So the second order logic is essentially has, in addition to notations of FOL, has quantifiers with propositional or functional variables as operator variables. So here is the sentence. There exists P for all X, Px or Px plus 1, okay, and not Px and Px plus 1. I think I made a mistake even here, okay. So the point is, this is satisfied that Px is true for a set of even numbers. You couldn't have actually talked of this sort of a situation earlier. So it turns out this is actually a sentence, what you would call existential second order logic. So one single existential quantifier. And today, with everything that has happened, it's a very interesting logical model because sentences which can be written in second order existential logic are exactly the sentences in class NP. I would imagine that most of us here have studied computer science at some level, so class NP is understood, but a little later we'll talk about that too. So this is the celebrated Fagin's theorem, which was done in the mid-70s. Okay, so in some sense, we have laid down exactly what formalism that was created in the early part of the 20th century, okay, was all about. Okay. So, in some sense, this was a part of Hilbert's agenda. Okay. But the strangest thing happened in the year 1930. Okay. With the logic of arithmetic, let me just mention a little bit about logic of arithmetic. This FOL, with the arithmetic formulas that can be described in sentence FOL, which has functions and addition and multiplication, which are functions for addition and multiplication. Functions are addition and multiplication, and if you add to it the axioms of number theory, you get arithmetic basically. Okay. So, together with the axioms of number theory, we have a logical system defining arithmetic. Okay, so this was understood in the early part of the 20th century. And effectively, by working with Hilbert's agenda, it was thought that yes, indeed, this axiomatic system will be complete. Mathematics is complete in the sense that using those axioms, all true sentences of arithmetic can actually be derived. Okay. So that was the expectation. Nobody ever thought that the axiomatic system of arithmetic will be incomplete. Okay. And so, in 1930, or the Gödel's theorems, which were published in 1931, okay, essentially shook up mathematics in a very big way. Okay. Incompleteness of arithmetic. Essentially, what Gödel showed was there exists no algorithm with the help of which, using the axioms of number theory, we can derive precisely the valid sentences of arithmetic. Okay. No axiomatic system exists for arithmetic. Okay. Which basically, essentially said that mathematics is richer, much more richer. You have no idea how rich it is. That this whole business of axiomatization that Hilbert was talking about is simply not possible. Okay. And added to it is the undecidability. It's a corollary. It basically says that there exists no algorithm by help of which we can decide for every arithmetical sentence in finitely many steps whether it is valid. Okay. As a computer scientist, we understand that the moment we use the term algorithm, the finitely many steps is actually implied, because we have a notion algorithm is different from a procedure. So all that is there. But at that time, the notion of algorithm was still in the process of evolving. Okay, so undecidability of arithmetic was a part of it. So it shook up the logician or the logician's part of this mathematics community. But people said, okay, this is probably with arithmetic. Maybe if we don't work in arithmetic, just work it under first order logic. Maybe for first order logic, problems of the type which has come up for arithmetic won't exist. Okay, so in 31, people in some sense tried to, let's say, get over this negativity by saying, well, look, first order logic is still safe. Okay, right? So, what was Turing's agenda? Turing's agenda was to settle the Einstein-Zung's problem, which is decision problem for FOL, first order logic. That was the agenda that Turing was working with. Okay, there was a context. He did not sit under a tree and saw an apple falling and developed a theory. He existed in a universe where things were happening. Okay. There was a context to what he was doing. And that is very important to understand. That, look, nothing really happens without a context. Okay. The genius of Turing was that in the process of settling this issue, okay, he came up with notions which have had a profound impact on the way computer science has developed as a subject. Okay. The important thing is, and I'm mentioning it as a piece of historical aside, that the decision problem for FOL is also not decidable. Okay. was proven by Church, okay, around the same time as Turing did, using his own notion of computation, which is lambda calculus. Okay. Understand that at that time, computers didn't exist. All that existed were mechanical, specialized devices by which you could add, multiply numbers. Okay. Just like calculators that you actually work with. And those at those times were big, huge mechanical devices on which you actually rotated with a handle, and then you got some answer. Okay. And so people were developing notions of computation without machines existing. So already, lambda calculus was developed by Church. Recursive function theory also was developed by Ackermann a little earlier. Okay. And what Turing did was develop a machine-based model of computation. He developed a machine model which he called A machine. A was automatic or abstract. In his paper, this paper on computable numbers with an application to the Einstein's problem, which interestingly now, if you look for it on your browser, shows up the first thing right at the top, and you can download it. And that's the something which has happened in the last 2-3 years, that all Turing's papers are now available. And you all of you can actually download them and read them if you want to. I did it also. I'll talk about that too in a few minutes. But let's understand. So he came up with this notion of what he called A machine, which we call Turing machine, right? And people always wonder, how did he come up with that idea? Okay. The real difference in pedagogy in the time when I was a young man, okay, in late 1960s and early 70s, was that the books that we used, people who taught us, were fully aware of the process by which Turing came up with the idea. And there was no way that in a course on automata theory, the person who's teaching would not talk about exactly how did this model came about. Okay? And we understood it, and we understood what was happening. Now, this thing has been so formalized that it is just put up on the board. And how did he come about it? Okay? So I'm going to spend some time with you in actually going through that crucial part of Turing's paper, where he gives a pseudo-psychological argument about what a computing machine should be capable of doing. Okay. Remember, the term there's the term computer will appear a lot of the time. But remember, the computer that he's talking about is a human being. Okay. At that time in the writing, computer is a human being, not a machine. Okay. So, Turing's A machine. Okay. Now, the next few transparencies are essentially extracts from his paper. And I'm going to read them out. And you should also read them at your own speed. You'll understand every word of it. It's English. And if you thought, you would also think in the same way. Nothing very profound, but he took a process of reasoning to its logical conclusion. So he said, all arguments which can be given are bound to be fundamentally appeals to intuition. And for this reason, rather unsatisfactorily mathematically. Okay. Computing is normally done by writing certain symbols on paper. We may suppose this paper is divided into squares like a child's arithmetic book. Okay. In elementary arithmetic, two-dimensional characters of the paper is sometimes used. It is used because when you write down, you want to add, you want to use the columns for place values. Right? It's used. But such a use is always avoidable. And I think it will be agreed that two-dimensional character of paper is no essential of computation. I assume then that the computation is carried out on one-dimensional paper. Okay, that is on a tape divided into squares. I should also suppose that the number of symbols which may be printed may be finite. Okay, and why so? If we were to allow an infinity of symbols, then there would be symbols differing to an arbitrarily small extent. Okay, right? And it's absolutely correct there. And distinguishing between symbols itself will become an issue. Okay, so it is always possible to use sequences of symbols in the place of a single symbol. One thing is saying finite symbols. Okay, now within finite, he says you can actually reduce the number of symbols also, not very large, okay, symbols. The difference from our point of view between the single and compound symbols, if they are too lengthy, cannot be observed at a glance. That is, we cannot tell at a glance whether this sequence of 9s and the next sequence of 9s are the same. Okay, so you can't do it at a glance. So what you have to do, the behavior of the computer, which is a human being, at any moment by the symbols he is observing and his state of mind at that time. The behavior of the computer at any moment is defined by these things. We may suppose that there is a bound B to the number of symbols on squares which the computer can observe at any moment. If he wishes to use more, he must use successive observations. We will also suppose that the number of states of mind which need to be taken into account is finite. Human beings' states of mind are also finite, he says that. Okay. The reason for this are of the same character as those which restrict the number of symbols. Let us imagine that the operations performed by the computer are split up into simple operations, which are so elementary that it is not easy to imagine them, that they are further divided. Every such operation consists of some change of the physical system consisting of the computer and its tape. Okay, right, the computer is a human being. There's a change taking place. We know the state of the system if we know the sequence of symbols on the tape, which of those are observed by the computer. He's talking about what's called the ID of a computation, which is nothing but the state of the machine, the tape itself, contents of the tape, and a pointer as to where the read head is. Okay, possibly with some special order, okay, with the collection of symbols we looked at, and the state of the mind of the computer. We may suppose that in a simple operation, not more than one symbol is altered, and without loss of generality, assume that the squares whose symbols are changed are always observed squares. Okay. You can't change something that you're not seeing. If you're seeing a few symbols, you can only change that and move. Right? Okay. Besides these changes of symbols, the simple operation must include changes of distribution of observed squares. You're shifting the head. Okay? The new observed squares must be immediately recognizable by the computer. Let us say that each of these new observed squares is within L squares of an immediately previously observed square. The simple operations must therefore include changes of the symbol on one of the observed squares, changes of one of the squares observed into another square within L squares of one of the previously observed squares. Okay? It's all there. Okay. It may be that some of these changes necessarily involve a change of state of mind of the computer, the human being. The operation actually performed is determined by the state of mind of the computer and the observed symbols. In particular, they determine the state of the mind of the computer after the operation is carried out. Okay, he has, in this process, explained to you why and what is the crux of computation. And then he comes up with the punchline. We may now construct a machine to do the work of this computer. Okay, that's it. It's a process. He thought about it, and he did it. Okay. The interesting thing basically, how old was he? How old was he in the year 1936? He must have done it in 1935. He was born when? 1912. 23. Where was he? He was doing his PhD at Princeton. Okay. PhD happened 3 years later. Okay. Right? But it's a process of thinking about something, a big problem around you. And big problems exist all over. Even today, there are big problems around. Okay, the question is, are we spending our time thinking about the big problems? Okay, or we have set the agenda of our lives to some small problems, moving from here to there, earning this money, doing this, doing that. You know, many things that people set agendas of. But what was Turing's agenda? Solving a big problem. Okay, you don't have to be, you know, person who has done 20 courses, understood the subject in totality, and then you can solve a problem. The chances are that you will never do anything. If you're going to solve a problem, you'll have to think about it and passionately feel that that's what you really want to do. Okay. Right? The interesting thing is, when I read the paper, again, okay, I never read it earlier because now when you read it, you see it's all there, but you don't read it. Why? Because what the future has done is simplified his notation. Okay. And you feel that, yes, he could have written things better, but that's the foresight of the future. You know, I read also his paper that Nilima talked about, biology. Is written in the same style. Of course, that was written in 1951. This was 36. Written in the same style. And I read every word of it, simply because I was not influenced by my new knowledge of that area. And I could follow everything that he was saying. Okay. But this earlier paper, which is a part of our own tradition of doing things, is something that one looks at and says, okay, it's all there, let's move on. What's the new thing he's saying? And the interesting thing is that there are issues that he discussed at the end of the paper. Okay. Computation of real numbers, rational analysis, a subject that he created really. Okay. Which the books that were available to us in the late 60s, early 70s on computation always had a chapter on. Okay. Now it's all gone. So the trend, fashions keep changing, but the fact of the matter is that he saw through so much in that paper that is absolutely unbelievable that he could do so. Okay. That he came up with the machine, this machine is, the way you reason, you say, yeah, right, I could have done it too. And I can, if you said I could have done it, I say, agreed, absolutely, you could have done it. You simply have to sit down and think about the problem. Okay. But what he really did, and I think the most important that he did in this paper was the notion of a universal Turing machine. This is what has actually transformed computer science. Okay. The interesting thing is that this notion of a universal Turing machine is easy to define. The notion of universality is easy to define within the model that he created. It's not easy to talk about that in lambda calculus or recursive function theory or word systems that existed at that time. Okay. And if Turing had not been there, the undecidability of FOL would have been established, was established by Church, but this notion of universality would not have come for God knows how many more years. Okay. So, what is this notion of universal Turing machine? There exists a Turing machine which, when given a coded description of any Turing machine T, and the data X on which T is supposed to work, will output T, that will output what T will output on input X. Okay, that there is such a machine. On the tape, T's description is given, transition function is fully defined. The string that is given, there's also on which it's going to work is also given. And this machine will, if you think about it, you say, yeah, it's possible that you will keep track of which state you are in, what exactly is the machine doing, and keep shifting from here to there, keep doing it. Okay? People who teach automata theory explain this all. It's possible. Where was this universal Turing machine really required by him? Because he made the diagonalization argument become available to him for showing that first order logic was undecidable. What he really showed was that it could not be decided. There could not exist an algorithm in the sense of an algorithm. That's something that will always stop. That such a Turing machine on some input X will ever stop, or will stop with some particular output. These are all traditional, simple exercises that we actually do. But that's what he did. Okay. And then he coded the working of a Turing machine by sentences of first order logic. Okay. Older books talk about Gödel numbering, which is nothing but a way of mapping everything to an integer which you will actually operate on. Okay. And then the moment he did it, it followed that the undecidability of Turing machines implied undecidability of first order logic. So he simply settled the matter once and for all. Higher order logics are incomplete, undecidable, everything is second order logic has those problems. Okay. But this is what he actually did. Okay. And as I'm asserting, and I will assert a little later also, that the most important thing here was the notion of universality in computation, that there is a machine which can simulate the behavior of any other machine. Okay, so we're not going to the proof. That's not the idea here. But that's a simple proof. Anybody who understands it can actually follow. And having seen what Turing did at the age of 23, 24, we'll simply look at what else did he do in his life. In some sense, Neelam has already talked about it. Okay, he worked on common knowledge about Turing's work. Okay, code breaking, the Enigma machine. Okay, there are books on it, there are movies made on that, and they make interesting stories. Okay, books probably tell you a little bit more about the technical issues involved in it, and I would suggest that you perhaps should get hold of one or two of them and read. They're exciting things as to what was happening, how did he do it. Okay, artificial intelligence, Turing test. Okay. The most important thing again was the notion of a stored program computer notion, because the universal Turing machine that he actually talked about talked in terms of the fact that the program that you're going to work with is already stored on the machine. Machine does not have to have anything else in it. Okay, works on a program. And there is enough historical insight that has now developed of what happened during those times that yes, indeed, it was Turing's ideas, and Turing had meetings with people like von Neumann. Von Neumann in USA was involved in the design of Turing, let's say, first computers. Okay, Kurt and Mauchly were doing it at the University of Pennsylvania, but von Neumann was the one who influenced them. No, it has got to be stored program. Okay, Konrad Zuse was also in Germany influenced. And Turing himself actually was a part of the team which worked upon a machine, stored program machine at Manchester. Okay, so this notion of a stored program machine is in some sense has come up simply because of Turing. Because if you read what people who are basically who write about science in a historical manner, okay, point out that the thinking of the others was design a specialized machine. Easy to do, something that will do some tasks very fast. Okay, but he said, no, it has got to be general purpose. Okay, and I'm going to spend some time now on Turing's contributions to biology. This paper is something that he wrote in 1951. Okay. Let me see. I can get a title. So the title of the paper is The Chemical Basis of Morphogenesis. Morphogenesis is the process by which biological entities take shape. Okay. Understand something very important. People understood there were these complex, large molecules like DNA at that time, but the genomic nature of the DNA had not been worked out. Okay. People understood that yes, genes are part of the DNA and they actually take some effect upon what is happening. So what he says basically, and I'm going to read out the first 2 or 3 lines of the abstract and nothing else. It is suggested, that's what he is suggesting, it is suggested that a system of chemical substances called morphogens reacting together and diffusing through a tissue is adequate to account for the main phenomena of morphogenesis. That's it. So, sitting there, he was essentially developing a theory, okay, and he developed this whole notion of reaction diffusion systems, okay. This paper is, again, reasoning from first principles about biology, about the diffusing processes in tissues, and the mathematical modeling that one does of these reactions and diffusing processes. Okay. The interesting thing to me is that he developed the model. It's a complicated simulation, but he developed enough mathematical insight that he could actually infer what the solution, the stable solution to the process is going to be when computers didn't exist. Okay. This is something of a skill that we are now losing. Okay, we have computers available to us, we take these fancy models, write programs, and allow change variables, change values, parameters, run them up, see the result. Okay, but Turing did all that on a piece of paper, on a paper. It's all, and the interesting thing is, it is absolutely readable. And I read it, and I think I understood a lot of it. Okay, very impressive. It's as impressive as the paper that he wrote in the 30s, because it follows the same tradition. Okay. Now, of course, what Turing did does not explain morphogenesis in its entirety, because morphogenesis, now we understand, is based on the genetic code. And we understand that this genetic code is actually also a program, and part of the program actually, the cell as a machine actually interprets. It's like a Turing machine or a universal Turing machine. The cell is a universal Turing machine of sorts, working on a program written on the code. And is in the process also is playing parts, which a simple model of type he was talking about could not quite do. Okay, so, but what he did in the early 50s and wrote a paper about, started to become, working with it started to become possible by the 80s. In what sense? That computers were powerful enough for us to be lazy and write simulations and see and visualize the results. Okay, so from 80s, this work of Turing, because of the fact that we didn't have to do the maths, okay, we had the computer to run it all for us, okay, started getting a lot of attention, okay. So I'll talk about it and show you some of the things that people did. Morphogenesis, biological process that causes an organism to develop its shape. And in this chemical basis of morphogenesis, Turing laid the mathematical foundation of reaction diffusion processes that enable stripes, spots, spirals to arise out of homogeneous uniform states. In some sense, theory of chaos, okay, is implied here. Okay. Now, next few slides are very interesting. Okay. Now, here is this paper which appeared in Science, is explaining the phenomena in terms of two morphogens, which are in a homogeneous system with maybe some sort of a membrane in between. And there is this process taking place, diffusion taking place. One of them is an activator, the other is an inhibitor. Okay. So when these things, oh my God, we'll have to answer and put the phone on silent mode. Sorry. Okay. So effectively, what says is that, look, if these morphogens simply interact in the manner that has been indicated in the second thing here, you might get patterns. You can actually create patterns of this type. These are, of course, idealized. But when they actually also move about in a wavier manner, then you can get spots, stripes, labyrinths. Okay. So there is this model which S. Miyajima has generated and appeared in Science. Okay. So this is the model. Now, using this model, people have been able to write simulations, Turing simulations, and also show that what simulations Turing simulations actually come out actually appear in, have been noticed in real life. Okay, so here is Turing patterns on a thin slab of gel. Okay, this is actually patterns which have been observed. Okay, right? Turing patterns on a seashell. The left shell is a photograph. Okay, and on the right shell is the, let's say, simulation. Okay, carried out using Turing's model, and shows that these are the type of patterns that you could actually create on a shell. So this is happening there too. Okay. Turing patterns around eyes of pufferfish. Okay, there are these fish, and working with same model, slightly different initial conditions, playing with parameters, you show that yes, indeed, you can create the circular pattern, which is around the eye of the fish on top, and you can create the radial pattern, okay, which is around the eye of the fish on the bottom. Okay, so nature clearly is doing something in a similar way as what Turing worked out for himself. Okay. Here is Turing patterns, the zebrafish model organization. Here, actually, this is where they, on a fish, as the fish was growing, they manipulated, they created certain patterns on the surface of the ship itself, of the fish itself, and notice as to what these interventions that they did actually did in creating of patterns. Okay, so a type of modification done here resulted in these straight lines and so on and so forth. Starting with initial patterns in simulation, okay, the same stable patterns of a similar type were generated. So this is, okay, here Turing patterns in cells in slime mold. Okay, Turing patterns can evolve not just in chemicals, but large complex systems in which each unit, for example, cell is distributed like molecules of pigment. Okay, so remarkable man. Okay, working first principles. Okay, looking at a problem. Okay, working out a solution which could be followed by anybody. Okay, but not only working out a solution, working out an analytical form of it by which he could actually assert that these things will actually be observed. Okay, so this is the impact that Turing has had in biology, and it is now recognized. You simply have to do what I did. Turing patterns, search Turing in biology. There's so much of material, all these things that I picked up is from the web. Okay, it's all there. And if it is there, it's simply because there is a tremendous amount of interest in what his models actually can lead to. Okay. Well, now I've come to the last few minutes of my talk. Okay, and let's just think of what is Turing's legacy. Okay, he died in 54, right? What has happened since then? Okay, which we think couldn't have happened, wouldn't have happened in the way it has happened if he didn't exist. Okay, and in my opinion, and these are 3 or 4 points that are my own personal assessment, that the most important thing that he enabled to happen is to come up with the notion of non-determinism. Okay. Non-determinism as a model, computing model, this was written about in late 1950s. Okay. Dana Scott got an immediate Turing Award for it because it simply changed the way in which one looked about computation. Enabled us to think in terms of what is the nature of the difficulty in the process of solving problems. Okay, it's possible using non-determinism to define classes like NP, problems which can be solved in polynomial time by non-deterministic machines. Okay, class P, and varieties of other things that have happened in the theory of complexity. Okay, the fact that in the early 70s, okay, the notion of NP completeness got formalized. Okay, that got done around 1972. Okay, when one actually started understanding, okay, what was the basis of what did problems share when they were complex, at least to be solved algorithmically. When that started getting understood, in my opinion, something very big happened. Okay, apart from complexity of computation, cryptography. Okay, the notion of public key cryptosystems, okay, came out in the year 1975. Okay, because in 72, 73, this notion of NP completeness was starting to getting understood, and that particular thing enabled people to think in terms of one-way functions. Okay, to be able to say that, look, all that you want is that the inverse problem should be very difficult to compute, and you had a basis for saying that yes, this is a difficult problem to compute. Cryptography as we know it, RSA and public key crypto system would not have happened, okay, had theory of NP completeness not been developed. Okay, otherwise one would have done things in the standard way that we are doing it. Okay. Notion of universality. The notion of universality has resulted us in defining a computer, a device that calculates in the way that we know it. But universality is a very important notion. Okay, and it's something that think about it. Specialized devices like pagers, okay, or existed in a small period of time. They just vanished the moment the cell phone was developed. Okay. Printers, the IBM Selectric typewriters, okay, which IBM made a huge amount of money in the 60s and the 70s, okay, vanished in no time, okay, the moment the personal computer came up, right? So these specialized devices will have a small existence, but if you give to a device universal capability, then the device will continue to evolve to new uses. And that's exactly what is happening to cell phones. Okay, there's now really no difference between a handheld cell phone device or a laptop or a computer. They are essentially the same thing. Okay, and it's all simply because of the notion that you're bringing in universality in the design of things. Okay, and finally, this universality is resulting in the ultimate computer. The ultimate computer is the internet. Okay, it's the universality of all these computers that existed, which have enabled, this notion of a click has enabled for the people to share, communicate, collaborate, do things on the net. And the net now is, in some sense, a computing device. Okay. Cloud computing and varieties of things. Okay. Wouldn't have happened without this notion of universality. Okay. And in that sense, I consider that Turing's influence on the development of computing as we know it is perhaps as fundamental as Darwin's models and theories had on understanding evolution in biology. They transformed a worldview. And Turing has also, in some sense, created this transformation in human beings in the way they look upon themselves and look upon the world with which they operate, okay, because of this notion of universal computing that he has actually brought about. In many ways, if Turing didn't exist, okay, 2012 would have come, right? But computing, the way it has developed, would it have happened? Probably not. If the Turing machine, universal Turing machine model didn't exist, I shudder to think whether I would have become a computer scientist. Probably not, because I would have had to handle lambda calculus, recursive function theory, other things which are useful, very nice mathematical models, but don't seem to talk in that direct way of what is computable and what is not. Okay. So things would have happened. The notion of universality would have come sooner or later. Turing machine would have come, it's not very clear to me. Okay, maybe someone would have come up with finite automata models were developed by Kleene and all in the same time, right? Okay, McLuhan Pitts, all that thing happened. But would someone say, add a tape? Speculative. When would have happened? What form it would have taken? So Turing has transformed us as human beings, as the world in which we live in, okay, and where we will be in future. So, okay. So it's good to recognize that about this remarkable man. Okay. We in this process recognize what we call human beings, okay, which in some sense have this ability to create or these fundamental insights at various periods of time, which result in some sense, total transformation of cultures and societies and the way we organize ourselves. It's a trait among human beings, an ability among human beings. There will be Turings in future too. There are others in other areas which have shown this ability. Feynman, Einstein. Every century has individuals of this remarkable ability. Okay, thinking about them, emulating them is one way by which we can enrich ourselves and our lives. Thank you. I would just end with what I think is a reasonable set of readings. These are books which are available. And the reason I'm talking about them is also because of various things that they are there. Alan Turing's The Enigma is a book, it came out in 1980s. It's a biography, worth reading. It's available in paperback. Okay. The second book, Alan Turing, is by Sarah Turing. Sarah Turing was Turing's mother. This book was written 5 years after his death. Okay. We don't want to talk about today about those aspects of his life and the society in which he lived in. So his mother wrote a book, very personal, about the environment in which Turing actually grew up. Turing's father was an ICS officer in India. Okay, but the family decided that the children will grow up in England. Okay, the mother shifted. Okay, he was born, conceived in India, born in London, Maida Vale. Okay, and it's a book by the mother. Okay, Alan Turing, his work and impact by Barry Cooper and Van Leeuwen. They're both computer scientists. Okay, so this is a formal assessment of his work. Unfortunately, the book is not yet out. It will be released at the end of the year. Okay, this would be a very definitive work on what exactly is Turing did. Okay, Turing by Andrew Hodges. This is the same person, written a 93-page book, made it smaller, the person. Very nice, very readable. Okay, it's in their Great Philosopher series. Okay. Martin Davis, mathematician and logician, okay, and many of us have actually learned computability using his books on recursive theory and computability, has written this book, The Universal Computer, the road from Leibniz to Turing. Okay. Absolutely worth reading. You will understand this intellectual development that has taken place in this process of computing. Okay. The next two are very interesting. Turing Evolved by David Kitson is a science fiction novel. Okay. Right? Based on the idea of intelligence becoming super intelligence. Okay. So Turing Evolved. The next book, Turing, a novel about computation, is by Christos Papadimitriou. People in computer science know who Christos Papadimitriou is. He's a professor of computer science at Berkeley. His contributions to the development of the work during the time from mid-70s to now are phenomenal. A true inheritor of Turing's traditions. Okay. And he has written a novel from a perspective that maybe Turing still exists in some sense. Okay. So, very nice books. That these are not the only thing that you can read. But beyond all that, if you simply think about computation, you then would do nothing but follow the traditions and the agenda set by Alan Turing. Thank you. Okay, all right. Okay. All right, maybe I'll just take it off. How do I, someone take this pen drive out.
Thank you, Professor Maheshwari, for beautifully bringing about the Turing's legacy, starting from non-determinism to NP completeness, without which cryptography wouldn't have been there, and without which internet wouldn't have been there, and leading to internet being the ultimate computer in the form of cloud computing. And a wonderful collection of readings on Alan Turing. That's very, very impressive. Most of the times, like, we are surfing through the net looking for material, but this is a wonderful collection now that we have a specific query to make from the Google. So thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Any questions? Or you would like to defer it to tea or lunch? If you have some questions, you can ask.
You spoke of the legacy of Turing, so this is a little hard question. What do you think would have happened to us if Turing had lived for much longer?
Very interesting. The question is, had he lived longer, what would have happened? Much of all this would have happened much faster. For individuals like us, life may not have been that exciting because most problems would have been solved by him. Okay, and many more. The subject would have evolved in a way in which it has, but much faster, much faster. Okay, and all of us would be doing something, but not necessarily what we are doing today. Yeah.
I would like to request Mrs. Vidya Kulkarni to present the memento to Professor Maheshwari. We'll now take a break for tea for half an hour and come back here in half an hour. Yeah.